This week we're talking about quantitative research, and we're going to start off by talking about non-experimental and then move into experimental designs. With non-experimental designs, you're essentially looking at four primary types. One is descriptive studies, and we'll break these down one by one as we move through the slides. Two is relationships, so that may be under the title of comparative or correlational. And then we move into causal comparative. And then last you have ex post facto, and oftentimes that's done with surveys or information that's pre-existing. The purpose of non-experimental designs is to describe current existing characteristics such as things like achievement, attitudes, relationships. So we're trying to answer some sort of research question that goes into pre-existing data. Descriptive studies look at pre-existing phenomenon and pre-existing data. There's a statistical nature for these descriptive studies. Typically it looks at things like frequencies, percentages, averages, and takes the data and kind of compiles it together to give you a complete picture of what is already happening. When you're looking at evaluating descriptive studies, it's really important to make sure that you're not drawing conclusions about relationships, but you are adequately describing the subjects and instruments that are being described and used. So an example of a descriptive study would be looking at standard of learning scores by students in third grade. The descriptive study might break down the ethnicity, the race, the socioeconomic status, or the grade level of students, but you're not going to look at anything that is causal in terms of those relationships. So while a group of students may have a high score, you wouldn't say because this group of students have a high score, it must be because they are in these particular classes or this socioeconomic status range. You're only looking at describing what the data says. Where descriptive designs talk about pre-existing data and just describe the information, comparative designs talk about relationships. It looks at the relationships between two or more variables. So you can see on the screen there's some examples of comparative studies. So the first one is if math scores for males are significantly higher than those for females, a relationship exists between gender and math achievement. So there is some sort of statistical measure that's making these comparisons. You could look at whether third grade achievement scores for females are not significantly different than those for males, so you would say that no relationship exists between gender and achievement. So you are investigating, or the researcher is investigating, relationships between variables. If you're looking at a comparative study and you're trying to figure out if it is high quality, you should see that all the subjects and instruments are completely defined and described. There should be some sort of criteria for identifying the different groups that are being studied. So if we're talking about low economic status or high, there should be a definition about what those are. There should be no inferences made about causation. So even though we're looking at relationships between variables, we're looking at the correlation between the two, but we're not saying necessarily that one causes the other. What we are saying is that there is a difference, there is a relationship between the variables, but we can't say that being a female causes higher scores. And so those are all important pieces to take into consideration when you're identifying and examining the comparative studies. Correlational designs are similar to comparative designs, except that correlational designs look at directionality. Whereas a comparative design, the slide we looked at before, we said that if scores for males are higher than those for females, then there's some sort of relationship. With correlational designs, we look at directionality with those relationships. So for example, if we know we have high math achievement, then we also have positive math attitudes. Or if a teacher is highly effective, then a teacher also has a high degree of self-efficacy. So there's directionality there. It could also be opposite. It could also be that low math achievement means that we have positive math attitudes, which wouldn't be the case, but that still demonstrates directionality. So what we would expect is that as math achievement increases, so does the attitudes, the positive attitudes for math. Or if teacher effectiveness decreases, then we would see that teacher efficacy also decreases. With correlational studies, you have a predictor and criterion, and these are very similar to your independent and dependent variables. So your criterion for the math achievement and math attitudes might be the math attitudes, whereas the predictor, what is predicting those math attitude scores, is the predictor. So your predictor is kind of what is influencing the secondary variable, which in this case would be math attitudes or teacher efficacy. It could also be switched around, but primarily you're going to be able to clearly identify the predictor and criterion variables. You need to use caution when you're looking at reading correlational studies. Some of the things that you want to consider is that even though we're talking about relationships between the two, again, we're not necessarily talking about causality. So even though we may say that as teacher effectiveness increases, so does teacher efficacy, it's not necessarily that one is causing the other. It's that they are there's a relationship and they're moving together on that continuum, but it's not necessarily causal. The other thing that you have to be careful about with correlational studies are large sample sizes or using too many variables, because that will increase the statistical significance of studies, but it doesn't necessarily make it meaningful. So if you have a lot of participants, then you could potentially have statistically significant results with correlational studies, but it's not necessarily a true representation of the data. So still within those correlational studies, you also have predictive studies. And in predictive studies, you're looking at the predictive nature or the relationships between two different variables. So one will predict the other. There's two types of studies that you'll see. One is simple prediction and the other uses multiple regression. And both of these also come into play when you're trying to select your statistical analysis in order to understand your data once you have it all together. In the next couple of slides, you're going to see examples of both simple prediction and multiple regression further. So breaking down these different prediction studies, the simple predictive study is looking at how one variable, which is the predictor that we just mentioned earlier, can be used to predict the performance of the second variable, which is your criterion. So some examples that are given is that the SAT scores can be used to predict freshman grade point averages, or an attitude scale in math is used to predict the achievement scores. So this is done through statistical measures. And there's a couple of things to make sure that you are taking into consideration some factors that influence correlations when you're reading research. One is that you have to make sure that the length of time between the data collection, between the predictor and the criterion, is appropriate. If we're looking at SAT scores and junior grade point averages, we would have to wonder what happens in between those two points of data collection. There's a lot of other things that come into play. So we have to be careful that if we're looking at how one variable impacts another, that there haven't been other extraneous variables that have kind of taken place in the meantime. And that also goes into another concern that you have to be careful about, is making sure that as you're reading the research, that you're not just looking at this one variable, because there's a lot of different factors, not just the one that's being examined, that could potentially influence the criterion variable. So you have to make sure that you're aware of that and you're reading the research critically to find those variables and those confounding components of the research. In a multiple regression study, instead of just looking at how one variable impacts another, you're going to look at several variables. Those are all going to be your predictor variables and how they predict the criterion variable. So in the last example, we looked at SAT scores and grade point average of freshmen. So in a multiple regression situation or study, you can look at SAT scores, high school grade point average, as well as class rank, and all those combined or even separately can be used to predict the high school freshman grade point average. This is done statistically during the data analysis. And so there's a couple things to make sure when you're reading research that you see, or if you decide to do a research study that uses multiple regression, you have to make sure that you have at least 10 subjects for each of the predictor variables. So you have to make sure you have enough participants to actually make the test statistically sound. And then you have to be cautious about relationships among the predictor variables. So you don't want to have predictor variables that have such a relationship that they're not really predicting the criterion variables. And one of the types of multiple regression analyses that you can use is something called logistic regression. And essentially what this does is it uses the predictor variables to kind of predict whether or not a participant is or is not going to fall in a certain category. So if we're saying that a student has a certain GPA, class rank, and SAT scores, will they make it through their first year of college? And so either they will or they won't. The other example given to you on the screen is whether or not a student will pass or fail a standardized test. Given a certain number of criterion variables, once you plug those in, it kind of gives you a prediction of what to expect with that final criterion variable. Correlational studies are going to give you something called correlational coefficients, and that's usually described with the letter R, a small r. And what a correlational coefficient is telling you is whether or not something has statistical significance. It's telling you if there is a statistical relationship that exists between the variables. In other words, is the observed correlation, is that significantly different than 0? So it's usually given to you in a number, and so what you will see is ranges of 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. All of those are different correlational coefficients. You need to have higher correlational coefficients with predictions with individuals as opposed to groups, again, because with statistical measures you want to have a large number of participants so that you have the statistical power. So you can start making predictions with correlational coefficients as low as 0.4 to 0.6, and anything that's just with individuals. So if you're just looking at a very small number of participants, your correlational coefficient has to be as high as 0.75. When you're looking at exploratory studies, when you're just getting started and starting to examine a topic, anything that's under 0.4 needs additional research. And the higher the correlation, obviously the stronger the relationship can be said that exists between the two variables. Whereas before we were talking about correlational studies, now we're going to start talking about causal comparative studies. And with causal comparative studies, we're able to look at the cause and effect of relationships. We're not just saying there is a relationship between factors, but with causal comparative, we're saying we can actually say because this variable moves in this direction, that causes the second variable to also move in the same direction. The causal comparative studies use pretty sophisticated statistics. You'll see both path analysis and structural equation modeling. You're not going to be expected to know how to do either of those. Those are pretty advanced statistical measures and would take some time to both instruct you and to master. But there are limitations to the causal comparative studies, just like there are to any other type of statistical test or research design. One of the ways that causal comparative studies can be designed is through ex post facto studies, and these are studies that look at relationships between variables that already exist and that cannot be manipulated. So either we can't go back in time